Stephen A., who's most to blame for the Spurs being blown out?
LaMarcus Aldridge. I mean, you could say Jaja Pachulia for getting Kawhi Leonard hurt, and we understand that, but that's an obvious one. But in terms of the Spurs and their roster, it's LaMarcus Aldridge. I'm going to keep reiterating this point. We knew before Kawhi Leonard signed his new deal, before the arrival of LaMarcus Aldridge, Max, that the San Antonio Spurs, the future was about two dudes. It was about Kawhi and ultimately LaMarcus Aldridge once he arrived. You knew that Tim Duncan was approaching the end. You questioned whether or not Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker were doing the same. And you thought that the Spurs were going to be relatively okay because Kawhi was ready to ascend and LaMarcus Aldridge had already established himself as one of the best forwards in the game of basketball. He comes to San Antonio, there are expectations. He shows up in the playoffs last year, averages near 40 in the first two games against Oklahoma City. Then the next thing you know, he nosedived over the last four games to the point where even Tim Duncan had to come in there and play big minutes in that closeout game 6 last year in Oklahoma City because LaMarcus Aldridge wasn't getting it done. Fast forward to this year, relatively pedestrian performances in the first round. Houston game 1, 2 of 7 shooting, just 4 points. Relatively pedestrian performances from pretty much most of these playoffs, with the exception of 2 road games in Houston where he showed up big. And then even in game 1, yeah, he had 28 points, but he's been 7 for 22 since Kawhi Leonard goes down. He's been ineffective. He's looked petrified and nervous and fidgety with the basketball. And then it regressed to a point yesterday where Greg Popovich was 1,000% right, Max. He pointed to L.A., LaMarcus Aldridge, literally not looking for a shot, not being aggressive. You know coming into the game, you have slim to no chance of beating the Golden State Warriors without Kawhi Leonard. But the Spurs have been in situations like that before, and they have fought, particularly when they have one man that's willing to step up to the plate and fight. Greg Popovich is saying he expected it to be LaMarcus Aldridge, and LaMarcus Aldridge didn't do that. So they really didn't have a chance from that point.
You didn't even get one of the top 3 answers, Stephen A. LaMarcus Aldridge, actually, Greg Popovich was asked point blank at the post-game presser about LaMarcus Aldridge. He says, look, the scoring has to come from somewhere. So he's either got to look for a shot, or if there are guys open, he's getting double, he's got to get the ball to the open man. But I'm paraphrasing, but the scoring's got to come from somewhere, and it's got to really start with him. So he called out LaMarcus Aldridge, and I'm going to get to that in a second. First, it is Jaja Pachulia. It is, because without Kawhi Leonard, you have a blowout. With Kawhi Leonard, at least it's not a blowout. If the question is, why did we get the blowout? No Kawhi Leonard. Now, you may argue, no, it's not Pachulia anyway, because Kawhi was already favoring that leg. And by the way, who says he makes it through that game, even had Pachulia not slid under him? And I tend to think maybe he doesn't make it through that game, but I bet you he plays in game 2, which wasn't the case there. The second thing is Steph Curry. Steph Curry is the reason they were blown out. Steph Curry had a big first half. He was shooting the 3. He was getting teammates involved, playing typically unselfishly. And as a result, as I've said all along, when Steph Curry is the engine of the Warriors, when he's the thing that's making them go, not only do they have an offense comparable to the Cavs, and I would argue better, but they're actually also excellent defensively. And Steph Curry is a little bit underrated defensively. That started with Mark Jackson and everything, but even you watch them play defense, Steph's not, he's a little bit light in the butt, as they say, Stephen A. He's not a big, strong guy, but he's not a tiny little guy either, and he actually does attempt to play defense. So Steph Curry is the engine of that team, is the second reason they got blown out. Now, thirdly, Father Time. See, you bring up LaMarcus Aldridge in terms of his reluctance to assert himself offensively. But that's not even the main reason they're missing Tim Duncan. Because by the end, Tim Duncan wasn't giving you 20 and 10, but he was giving you great leadership. It's hard to imagine an effort like that from the Spurs in a game as important as that to their franchise with Tim Duncan on the court and them sort of rolling over. And Popovich after the game saying, everyone but Jonathan Simmons. Simmons, who I've been talking about, is in a category by himself. Everyone else needs to be held accountable for that kind of lackadaisical play. With Duncan, I don't think it goes down that way. So, yes, you can identify Aldridge, but not just because he won't assert himself offensively. I think more importantly than that, it's that the guy he replaced, he was signed essentially to eventually replace some of the things Tim Duncan does. The guy he replaced was a great leader who would not have tolerated that kind of effort in a game as pivotal as that one.
Well, first of all, I don't feel the need to regurgitate that 1,000 times because I always bring up the fact that he's the successor to Tim Duncan, and he hasn't shown up at pivotal moments. I don't know how many times I've said that. That's number one. But I'll tell you something that I haven't said enough of. I've mentioned this several times in the past, but I'll remind you of this, Max Kellerman. You have to remember when LaMarcus Aldridge came to San Antonio, one of the things that happened was that Greg Popovich promised him he would stay if LaMarcus Aldridge signed with San Antonio. So you got a commitment from Greg Popovich, but Greg Popovich ain't getting the same kind of commitment from you in terms of your play. The consistency with which we came to rely upon from LaMarcus Aldridge has been nowhere to be found from him in a San Antonio Spurs uniform. And that's the crime in all of this. I remember seeing a LaMarcus Aldridge that would go to the hole and dunk on dudes. I remember seeing a LaMarcus Aldridge that was 6'11" and played like he was 6'11". I remember LaMarcus Aldridge. Now, granted, he was a number one option as opposed to a 2 or 3, and I get that. But the kind of game that Kawhi Leonard brings to the table assists you, if you're LaMarcus Aldridge, in being even more productive than you would have been in Portland. And somehow, some way, he has just had moments, glaring moments, big moments, where he is very small. He's nowhere to be found. And to have the height and the skill that he has and to play small. See, that's the key. If you're playing big, Max, but the shots ain't falling and you just, it's just too much, that's different. But when you are that size with those skills and you play small, that's flagrant.
Everyone's on the same page
really
about
is.
LaMarcus